At dawn on June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel, invading South Korea, thus beginning the Korean War.
Hello, I'm Rockpile Museum Assistant Justin Horn. The Korean War began 75 years ago this month. In this video, we will bring you a brief history of the Korean War, utilizing photos from the Rockpile Museum's collection. As a note, not all of the photos line up or correspond with the locations and battles mentioned. For example, while talking about the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, we show soldiers in Korea at wintertime, and not necessarily at the Battle of Chosin itself. There are also large numbers of photos in our collection taken by soldiers stationed in Japan during the conflict. We wanted to share these photos with you, as many of them have never been seen by the public before.
When North Korean forces crossed into South Korea, the U.S. was largely taken off guard, as the Truman administration's focus had been on Soviet activity in Europe. However, Washington rallied quickly to South Korea's defense, and Congress appropriated $12 billion for military action. President Truman also agreed to send U.S. troops to South Korea's defense just 2 days after the invasion. Part of this force was the Wyoming National Guard. They initially trained at Fort Lewis in Washington state before deploying to Korea for the duration of the war. When they left Wyoming, the Cowboy Guard took with them a souvenir, an Entering Wyoming highway sign, a tradition which has lasted to this day. Within days of the invasion, the South Korean army had retreated southwards, and large numbers of their soldiers had defected to the North Korean side. North Korean Premier Kim Il-sung falsely claimed South Korea's army had initiated the invasion, and that North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union, had begun a, quote, righteous invasion and would hunt down and execute the, quote, bandit traitor, democratically elected South Korean President Syngman Rhee. At the Battle of Osan, the first significant U.S. engagement, U.S. and South Korean forces had insufficient weaponry and were defeated by the North Koreans. The U.S. also suffered losses at Pyeontaek, Chojin, Chechuan, and Chijin. The North Korean People's Army steadily pushed the United Nations forces, led by the U.S., southwards. By September 1950, UN forces were hemmed into a corner of South Korea near Pusan. This 140-mile perimeter enclosed just 10% of Korea. During the Battle of the Pusan perimeter, UN forces withstood North Korean attacks. The U.S. Air Force launched 40 attack sorties a day, destroying 32 bridges as well as logistics depots, refineries, and harbors. They halted daytime railroad and road traffic. North Korean forces were forced to hide in tunnels by day and only move at night. The overextended North Korean army could no longer be supplied. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued to build up forces in Japan, preparing to launch a counterattack. To relieve the Pusan perimeter, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur planned an amphibious landing at Incheon, near Seoul, well over 100 miles behind enemy lines. For the landing, MacArthur activated a combined U.S. Army, U.S. Marine Corps, and South Korean force consisting of 40,000 U.S. troops and over 8,000 South Korean soldiers. By September 15th, the ambitious landing had succeeded, and amphibious forces had largely defeated the North Korean defenders at Incheon. On September 16, 1950, UN forces began a breakout from the Pusan perimeter. They advanced 100 miles to join the U.S. 7th Infantry Division at Osan. The U.S. rapidly defeated the North Korean defenders around Seoul and threatened to trap the North Korean forces. On September 25th, UN forces recaptured Seoul. The North Korean Army's rapid retreat left North Korea's capital, Pyongyang, vulnerable. By October 1, 1950, the UN command had driven the North Korean army past the 38th parallel, with South Korean forces rapidly in pursuit. General MacArthur demanded the North Koreans' unconditional surrender. And, with UN authorization, the UN command forces entered North Korea. The 8th U.S. Army drove northwards up the western side of Korea and captured Pyongyang on October 19th. On October 3, 1950, China attempted to warn the U.S. that it would intervene if UN forces crossed the Yalu River. The U.S. did not respond. U.S. policymakers, including Truman, considered it a bluff. 200,000 Chinese People's Volunteer Army troops crossed the Yalu River into North Korea on October 13th. China's boldness convinced an otherwise reluctant Joseph Stalin to send the Soviet Air Force in to provide air support. UN forces were now directly fighting a million-man Chinese army and the Soviet Air Force. UN forces engaged in a fighting retreat southward across the 38th parallel. Part of the fighting took place at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Temperatures dropped to negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit. As UN forces fell back, an estimated 4.5 million North Koreans fled southward with them. Chinese and North Korean forces captured Seoul on January 4, 1951. The setbacks prompted General MacArthur to consider using nuclear weapons. This, along with MacArthur's failure to anticipate the Chinese entrance into the war, led to President Truman relieving him of command. As the Chinese and North Korean Communist forces continued to push southward, they overextended their supply lines. UN forces rallied, and with names such as Operation Thunderbolt, Killer, and Ripper, were able to retake Seoul, the fourth and final conquest of the city in a year. Leaving it a ruin, the 1.5 million pre-war population was down to 200,000. People were suffering, and there were large food shortages. With the bucking horse and rider design emblazoned on their 105mm self-propelled howitzers, the Wyoming National Guard 300th Field Artillery, also known as the Cowboy Cannoneers, fought in many engagements in the Korean War. At the Battle of Soyang, they fired into the oncoming wave of 12 Chinese divisions, roughly 138,000 men. Unleashing their cowboy thunder, they fired 7,200 rounds in 24 hours and became one of the most decorated artillery units in the Korean War. For the rest of the war, the U.S. UN forces fought with the Chinese North Korean forces, but exchanged little territory. Dwight Eisenhower won the 1952 presidential election, in part with his promise to, quote, go to Korea and to quickly end the war. North Korea, China, and the UN command signed an armistice on July 27, 1953. South Korea, however, refused to sign. The armistice left the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, at the 38th parallel, and Korea has remained divided for the last 75 years.